Dan, once again, awesome to sit down with you and finally have this conversation. I'm really excited. I really do want to get into Ukraine stuff very quickly here, but first, I just wanted to briefly touch on some early life. Just wanted to better understand, where you're coming from and where you have come from and how that's kind of informed the person you are today, because I find that really fascinating. So let's just
Absolutely.
maybe start with, where you grew up and what that was like.
Well, I was born in Cambridge, Ontario, and then when I was about 5 years old, my family moved from Ontario to Canmore, Alberta. My father was a Slovak immigrant, and they knew some Slovak people that had moved out to Canmore and said good things about it. So, yeah, when I was about 5 or 6 years old, my family moved to Canmore. So I was very lucky to grow up in the mountains in the beautiful Canmore back when it was still just kind of a normal small town, if you can believe it. It hadn't been discovered internationally in the same way as it was after the 1988 Winter Olympics, and it brought a lot of international attention and, of course, investment in that area. And then more and more people, both internationally and here in Canada, have bought property there and changed it more into a tourist town for people who can afford that. Back then, it was just a normal small town, and I was very lucky to grow up there. And then after graduating from high school there, I came to Calgary and went to college here and have lived in Victoria for a few years. I went out to Ontario for law school and lived first in Kingston, where Queen's University is located, and then worked in Ottawa for a couple of years before returning to Alberta. So I've been a few different places, and so yeah, I've been around a bit. And every year we try to get to Europe, try to visit my wife's family at least once a year in Slovakia, and also to see my relatives, because as I mentioned, my father is from Slovakia. And that ties in, of course, to how this whole Ukraine thing happened in terms of my involvement.
Yeah, absolutely. I was curious because I've heard you talk a little bit before about living in different cities and then also making the move to Calgary and just
Mm.
how that city is kind of seemed to you coming from a different place. I know
Mm.
when I moved from a small town to Calgary, there was a lot of things that were strange to me. There was a bit of a culture shock, even with even though I was only moving an hour into the city, I was moving in from the small town of Strathmore, and I found it so much more impersonal all of a sudden. I actually
Mm.
struggled in some ways. Did you find that similar when you came to Calgary? And what were the differences in Calgary compared to other cities you've lived in?
Yeah, well, my first experience of living in Calgary was actually in grades 10 and 11, because my parents split up when I was around 12. And so my mother ended up coming to Calgary with my two sisters, and my brother and I were with my dad in Canmore. And when I reached grade 10, I thought, someday I'll go to college and it'll probably be in Calgary, and maybe it'd be good for me to get an experience of being in the city. So I came to Calgary in grade 10 and 11, and I definitely felt very much like an outsider. I was at a school where it seemed like a lot of people had more money and they were driving nice cars and everything, and I definitely felt like I didn't belong there very much. And I had left behind all these friends that I'd grown up with, like most of the kids who I was in grade 1 with in Canmore. I had still been in the same grade with them, like they hadn't moved away. We were all together still in grade 9, and now suddenly I was in Calgary, in this big city with traffic and the impersonal, like you say, the impersonal nature of just intrinsically, when you're in a huge place all of a sudden, and you compared to Canmore, which was only about 5,000 people back then, suddenly you feel pretty anonymous because nobody knows you, right? So after being in Calgary for a couple of years, I wanted to graduate with my friends back in Canmore. So I went back to Canmore for grade 12, which was really nice to see all those familiar faces again. And then when I finished high school, I applied to SAIT, so studied at SAIT for a couple of years. And then that was a really good experience. Found college much more enjoyable than high school. So that motivated me to continue with my post-secondary, and I ended up going to Mount Royal for a degree in communications. But yeah, so Calgary, I think any city would have felt for me, being this kid from a small town, would have felt kind of impersonal and loud and busy, and kind of you feeling a little bit lost in it.
Yeah.
Now that's changed over time, but I would say that, yeah, there's part of me that has always kind of missed that feeling of being in a small town where you feel like people notice you and there are people around you that care about you, and you feel intrinsically valuable, and integral to that place. And in a city, it's hard to really feel that. And so when I've been in other places like Victoria or Ottawa, which for various reasons, seem a little more inclusive. They have a stronger sense of community to me. Like, again, that's very subjective, but to me, I felt more connected to other people in those places. And certainly when I go to Slovakia, I feel more connected to the people around me because I think it's partly economic, where when people don't have a lot, then they rely on those social connections even more because they know they need other people to help them. Like if you can't afford to spend lots of money on a car repair, then you really need to have that relationship with somebody who can get you, connected to a friend who would not charge you too much for it. Or if your washing machine breaks down and you can't afford to buy a new one, then you need to know somebody who can fix it or who might give you their old one. So those social connections are so much more valuable and relied upon in a place like Slovakia, where the vast majority of people are just getting by economically. And so when we're there, people welcome us into their homes and we just feel so just embraced. And in Calgary, if you don't make the effort to connect with people, you can be very cut off from others. And that can be good for you. Hey, if you don't want, if you just want to do your own thing and have people mind their own business and so on, that's great. That can be a good thing. But at the same time, if you want to feel, like an integral part of a community, then sometimes Calgary can feel a little distant,
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That's interesting because it does seem like, especially in a city like Calgary, our wealth and our resources are an incredible blessing. And we are very fortunate, especially in the country that we live in, the city we live in, that we have more of that affluence. But it really does make you question whether or not that's actually in a soul sense or I guess in terms of nourishing our souls, like it has this real ability to disconnect us from our neighbors, and I think maybe ultimately from ourselves.
Yeah, I think so.
Speaking of university, you touched on that briefly. I just wanted to quickly drill into that. So you went to university at SAIT and then Mount Royal, and you said you were doing communications there?
That's right. So for SAIT, and it's funny because when I decided to go to SAIT right out of high school, it was partly because I didn't enjoy school very much. So I thought, well, 4 years of university, I don't want to commit to that. Like, I might not enjoy it. So 2-year program at SAIT. Okay, great. And I studied business. So I thought maybe I'll have my own business someday. So 2 years, get a business diploma, maybe have my own business. But then I enjoyed the experience so much that I thought, you know what, another 4 years of this is not such a bad idea. Why not? And I love books and writing and reading. And so I thought I should study journalism because if I have a skill in anything, it might be that, right? So I went to Mount Royal for a communications degree. It was an applied degree. So it was 3 years of classroom study and 1 year of work terms. And so I got a bachelor's of applied communications. And then a few years later, I thought, I might want to challenge myself academically even more. And so that's when I was 29, I decided to go to law school.
Wow. Yeah, I have a lot of questions about law and what that could potentially look like that I don't even know if I can fully go into. But one thing I really want to ask you about as well for your university experience was to my recollection, this is when you started kind of delving a little bit more into a different side of the city of Calgary, more like working with maybe underprivileged or troubled youth and kind of doing some journalistic work around that, but then also some of your own personal work. Do you mind going into that a little bit more?
Well, when I was in my second year, I believe it was a second year of studies at what was then Mount Royal College, which is now Mount Royal University, of course, I started a college magazine with a friend. And one of the first issues we covered was homelessness in Calgary. That made me reach out to find out I found then about the organization that you work with, The Doorway, and I interviewed a bunch of other people who are dealing with the homelessness issue for this magazine I was doing. And it was really inspiring to hear how committed they were to helping people. And it inspired me to then volunteer off and on over the years. I've volunteered with many organizations over the years, and including now, I volunteer with the Center for Newcomers, which helps all people new to the country who are here in Calgary, including refugees and others. Certainly my experience in Ukraine last winter lit that fire in me to definitely, when I got back to Calgary, find an organization that helps new Canadians and refugees in particular. I knew I wanted to volunteer in that area to feel a continued connection to that issue, because It was such a profound, powerful experience, what I felt last winter helping the refugees.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. What was your impressions of perhaps like those who are a little more marginalized before you went into the experience of working at the doorway and other avenues when you're in university? What was your impression of those individuals before that and then after that? Was there a change in how you viewed that population?
That's an interesting question. So if I was about 22 or so when I, for example, did that article about homelessness in Calgary and youth homelessness in particular. Prior to that, certainly before age 22, I hadn't done any volunteering anywhere that I can recall. But I grown up as a child of an immigrant, and we had very, very little money growing up. In fact, so one impression I'd have is just my personal experience where, imagine my parents go to Canmore, there are 4 kids. My father was trained in the trades in terms of fixing the old mechanical cash registers that used to be in stores. That's what he had done in Slovakia. Came to Canada, did that a little bit in Ontario. Not really need for that in a small town like Canmore. So he did a few different jobs and then ended up becoming a custodian, a janitor at the school in Canmore. And that's what he did my whole time growing up. So you can imagine that he wasn't making a lot of money as a janitor at a school, but it was enough to support our family. And there was a lot of generosity extended towards us. I remember growing up that we would sometimes get clothes donated to us, to our family from the church, for example. The Anglican church there gave us clothing, and which sometimes made me insecure because I was afraid that people would notice that I'm wearing clothing that had been donated, that they used to own or something. And I had friends in Canmore who some were well off, but I also had friends where they were very low income. They lived in the trailer park, or they lived in an older house or in an apartment and really struggled to get by. And so I was always around people who were struggling to get by, and that certainly made me sensitive to that issue. I've never taken things for granted. I didn't grow up going on fancy holidays or having things just given to me, right? So I grew up very poor, and so it certainly makes me sympathetic to anybody who's trying to get by in an honest way and trying to get ahead, and it's only primarily external things that are holding them back. That's where my sense of injustice really gets riled up, and I really want to make a difference when I see that someone's willing to work hard and yet they're not getting properly rewarded for it. That's what really gets me going, because the injustice of that is really so does that sort of, I hope that sort of answers your question.
Yes, absolutely. It's like a healthy anger towards the injustice.
Yeah. Righteous indignation.
That's a great way to describe
righteous indignation.
I really appreciate you sharing some of those moments that informed your early life. And I think it's deeply fascinating on a personal scale, but then I also feel like it's important to go through some of those things, because I really think that it kind of shows a trajectory of kind of what comes next in the story, which of course there are, I'm sure, many twists and turns that I would love to get into if we had the time. But I think it's important that we delve into Ukraine, because all of these other experiences you've had almost seem to lead to this point where you are on the border of Ukraine, I believe. So I was just curious, when the Ukraine situation happens, where are you and where do you hear about it? What's your initial reaction to it?
Okay, so to set up the background here a bit, I was working remotely for a law firm that I'd worked for a number of years, and my boss very graciously allowed me to do an extended trip to Slovakia so that we could spend a whole bunch of time with my wife's family. So we had arranged to stay in Slovakia for 6 months, from middle of November a year ago, 2021, until middle of May 2022. So that was what was set up, that I would work remotely from Slovakia for those 6 months. So last February 24th, which is the date that Russia invaded Ukraine, obviously it was major world news, and I was watching it very closely. I would have, regardless, so if I'd been in Slovakia or not, I would have watched this major event unfolding because I follow the news closely in general. So we're there in Slovakia. We're in Bratislava. Now, just to paint the picture, Bratislava is on the southwestern edge of Slovakia, and Slovakia is right there in the center of Europe. On the eastern border of Slovakia, it shares about a 100-kilometer stretch there's a border with Ukraine. Okay, so 100 kilometers on the far eastern edge of Slovakia, they share a border with the Ukraine. On Thursday, February 24th, early morning hours, Russia invades Ukraine. Immediately, there's major coverage, and there are stories and video, including video of people having to say goodbye to their families, because Ukraine has said that if you're between the ages of 18 and 60 and you're male, you cannot leave the country. You have to stay. You are conscripted. You must defend this country. So at the train stations and elsewhere at the border crossings, you see images of fathers saying goodbye to their small children. The children are weeping. You see mothers and wives saying goodbye to their husbands because the husbands have to stay behind. And as I'm the father of a 4-year-old boy and a 1-year-old girl. And I think that made it hit me particularly hard, seeing the families having to be separated in that way, because, the mothers and children had to be safe. Their homes were being bombed. There was no safety there. So they had to say goodbye, and they don't know if they'll ever see their husband or father again. And so it just hit me really hard emotionally, seeing that and knowing that I was in a country that bordered the Ukraine, that thousands of Ukrainians were now flooding into Slovakia and other neighboring countries, made me wish that I could do something. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, you know what, I can do something, because I have a vehicle that we've been renting, this Renault family vehicle that seats 6. There's an extra seat in the very far back. If you don't have a lot of luggage, you could seat a 6 passenger. So could seat up to 6 people. And I thought, I can do something. I could take donations to the border. I could bring food and water to the border, and I could bring people back. It's in my power to do that. Now, I had to consider, is it a wise thing to do? Is it safe to do that? And also, would my wife be willing to take that risk too? Because it's not just a decision I can make on my own, right? I had to get my wife to buy in and support this. And so I suggested to her, I said, I didn't think you'd stop me. I'd suggest that I'd drive to the border this weekend and help the refugees. And at first she didn't say much, but she didn't immediately say no. So which made me think, well, if she was going to, put up a fight and take a stand and say, absolutely not, you can't leave me alone with our kids, you can't put yourself at risk, you can't do all this, then she would have immediately said that. But she didn't immediately say no. So I thought, okay, got a chance. She's persuadable, maybe I've got a chance. And then later that day, I showed her another video of, people, a father saying goodbye to his wife and kids. And I said, I really got to do this if you're okay with it. And something else to paint the picture, you have to understand that neither of us had ever been to the eastern part of Slovakia. I am not fluent in Slovak. I only know a few words and phrases. And we're renting this older, I don't know how old, a 14-year-old vehicle or something. So, not a brand new vehicle. So there's a risk of it breaking down or something. And I'm driving towards a war zone, right? So you put all those factors together, and it was not an easy decision. But at the same time, it was I felt very compelled to do something if I could. And just to paint the picture, so Slovakia is in the center the center of Europe, and it is not a very large country. It's about 500 kilometers wide. And so I'm about that distance from the Ukraine borders, because the capital's on the western edge and Ukraine's on the eastern edge. But there's no Trans-Canada highway going, Trans-Slovakia highway going in a straight line to the eastern border. Right. So because of that, not a direct route. And some of the roads, especially once you get to the east, are narrow and winding and so on. So it takes at least 6.5 hours to get to that border. So it was a 6.5 hour drive each way, each time I went to the border.
Wow. That's obviously incredibly admirable and still fascinates me. It still blows my mind that you decided to actually take a practical response to something that was going on when so many other people would not. And obviously a lot of people chose not to. I would be curious to know, I'm sure you have so many different stories, and some that I've been privileged enough to hear about what that looked like when you decided to go down to the border. But if there was one in particular you could point out, or one that you could talk to us about, what do you think that would be?
One thing I'll say is that, and just to paint the picture again of exactly how this went down. So Thursday early morning was when the invasion happened. Friday early evenings, my wife Sylvia agreed that I could go to the border that weekend. So I immediately, on the Friday evening, went to the grocery store and filled up 3 or 4 shopping carts of groceries and water and diapers and whatever I could think of. I filled up the 3 shopping carts, loaded them into the car so that the car would be ready first thing in the morning for me to head to the border. And so the 6 in the morning, the next day, I headed to the border, not knowing exactly where I was going to go. I just heading to the border. And when I got there, there was a lot of, not chaos, but there was a lack of structure. There wasn't like somewhere to go to be like, I'm here with donations. And they'll be like, oh yeah, here, put the donations here. And, oh, you want to offer rides to people back to the capital? Okay, sign up here. There was nothing like that. And so that uncertainty remained. And in fact, it's striking that each trip I did, I ended up doing 5 trips to the border on the subsequent weekends. So it was actually 6 weeks in a row, because one weekend we all had COVID. So one weekend I couldn't go. But so it was 5 trips spread over 6 weekends. And every trip, there was a point where I thought, am I making a mistake? Should I have not come this time? Because I'd often have to wait to find people who needed to go that far. I'd often sometimes get some pushback from an organization that maybe was suspicious about motives because they're concerned about human trafficking. They're concerned about all these other things. So, or there's sometimes the police or the soldiers would give you a hard time, acting like you don't belong there, like just giving you a hard time. And so there was always that element of doubt that was also present. And yet at the same time, there was also a point on each of those trips where I was like, I'm so glad I went ahead and did it anyway. And usually that point was once I had the refugees in the vehicle and I was heading back toward Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia. Then I was like, I'm so glad I came because I'm able to help these people. So in total over those 5 trips, I brought 23 people, plus one of the families had a dog. So 23 people plus a dog is what I brought back. And each of those trips, I either brought a carload of supplies or I brought money in my pocket that friends and family had donated to me to help support these trips so that I could buy supplies once I got to the border. So yeah, every trip, it struck me as like how there were times where I was like in doubt of whether I was making a mistake by doing this, that I'd extend myself too far, or maybe my help wasn't really needed this weekend or whatever. And yet also every trip, there was a point where I was like, so darn sure, like, I'm so glad that I did this and that I'm here for these people. Now, first weekend, so you asked me, was there a particular story that stood out?
Yeah.
The first weekend, I brought back a couple of ladies and their 3 daughters. They were 2 separate families, but 2 ladies, and one had 1 child and one had 2. And I brought them back, and they were very fluent in English, particularly the one lady. Her name was Oksana. And so she was talking to me the whole ride back, which was wonderful because I was able to get some insight into what they were going through. And in many ways, they were kind of in shock. They'd been through this ordeal. Her particular family and her friend, they lived in the northern part of Ukraine, in a town that they're woken up at 6 a.m. from the sound of the airport nearby being bombed. And they immediately that same day left their home, and they had to travel 800 kilometers to the Slovak border. And they stayed along near the Ukraine border because that was the safest. That's where the least fighting was, somewhat ironically, but because in the northeastern part of Ukraine, that's not where the Russians were invading. That's the northwestern edge of Ukraine. Was not where the Russians were invading. They were invading the northeastern border primarily. So they'd had to travel for several days for 800 kilometers from their town to the Slovak border crossing. They had left the same day, the Thursday, and now when they got in my vehicle, it was the Sunday morning. And it had taken 10 or 11 hours to get processed at the border. So they had been dealing with that all night long. And then they get into my vehicle, and the relief that they felt once they were in the vehicle was very palpable, and it was very humbling to me that I was offering that to them, that comfort that you sit down, have a seat in the car, and then rest easy that in 6.5 hours or 7 hours we'll be in Bratislava. And they were going to Bratislava because the sister of the one lady had an apartment there, so it was there to greet them, when they arrived. And she wanted to know Canadians' perspective on this, like, were they supportive of Putin? Did they think that this is going to last long? How do they feel about Ukrainians? And I said, I believe that Canadians are very sympathetic to Ukrainians, and they feel very bad that this is happening, and they We hope that nobody knows how long it'll last, but we hope that this war will end soon. And it struck me that they told me that I was their hero and that I had a big heart. And it just was so wonderful for them to say that. But when they said that I was their hero, I said, no, I don't think I'm doing anything heroic. I said, I'm doing something, compassionate, but not heroic. I said the heroes are the men who are back there, fighting and risking their lives to defend their country. But it was just very humbling, and it was just so reinforcing that I'd done the right thing, that this effort, this exhausting trip I had done was worth it, to hear them, that gratitude. And that gratitude is echoed by people that I helped in the subsequent weeks, just saying how grateful they were, that not just myself, because there were many people helping. Like, let me be clear. I was one tiny fish in a huge pond. There were many people helping. And they had so much gratitude for all the different people of different countries who are helping Ukrainians. That gratitude was always what always permeated the conversations. And that was very sweet, very touching to hear that here they are. They've potentially lost their homes. Who knows if their home will be there when they get back, right? They've had to flee their country. They might lose their husband or father back in the Ukraine. And yet, the number one thing I'm hearing from people is the gratitude that they felt, that people cared about them, that other countries, that other people cared about what they were going through. That's what I heard from these refugees.
Wow. That's an incredible response to that kind of horror that's going on. Dan, Absolutely. Unfortunately, we don't have too much more time to talk, but this has really impacted your life beyond just what you did in Ukraine. What has your life looked like since you've come back to Canada?
Well, I immediately searched for what organizations help refugees here in Calgary. So immediately found out about the Center for Newcomers, which is an amazing facility. They recently moved locations just in the last spring. They are up near Marlborough Mall, near 16th Avenue, 32nd Street Northeast. They moved locations a couple blocks south. So they're still across from Marlborough Mall in this beautiful new facility. And they help tens of thousands of people every year, and they have a couple hundred staff to do that. And so it's been wonderful helping them by volunteering at various events. And also once a week, I've been going in to help in their job search center in the mornings. And then in the afternoon, I'm in the role of a roving ambassador, which means I greet people as they come in the front door and help alleviate the lineup that tends to happen if people come in waves. And before they go to the front counter, I ask them if there's something I can, answer for them. So it's been wonderful doing that. And I also did a presentation at Center for Newcomers about the Ukraine border trips. It was wonderful to do that presentation. And of course, reaching out to the doorway. I've been doing on a voluntary basis a newsletter for a karate association that I belong to. So making sure that I feel like I'm helping people is just really more central to my life than ever before. Yeah. And it also inspired me to leave the law firm I was working for and to start my own business, because it allows me to choose my clients. It allows me to just make sure that I have more control over things. See, the number one thing one of the big things that how it affected me personally is that it showed me the power of taking initiative, and how when your values and your actions are in alignment, then you tap into this tremendous source of energy and inspiration and resourcefulness. And knowing that I could do that in that circumstance, it made me realize, well, why don't I do that in other areas of my life? Why don't I do that with my career, where I make sure my actions and values are aligned and tap into that energy so that I can have that sense of purpose and meaning that I had on those trips, right? When I was driving to the border, I just felt every time like I was on a mission, and it was that I was doing something incredibly important, and everything else in my life seemed so trivial compared to that. Getting to the border, bringing the donated items, and bringing refugees back. Everything else seems so trivial in comparison that I didn't want to come back to Canada and feel like I was spending most of my time doing trivial things.
Right.
I refused to. I just couldn't do it. And I even at the time though thought to myself, how am I going to keep this sense of meaning going forward? Because I knew it's going to be a challenge. I knew that everything else is going to seem trivial unless I take an active role in seeking out those things or building that structure I needed in order to make sure that I'm doing what's meaningful. You know what I mean? Like I couldn't just passively hope that things come into my life that give me a sense of meaning. I knew that I was going to have to take an active role in creating it.
Yeah. Wow. I've told you before, but I find it just incredibly inspiring. And at some point I would love to pick your brain about how exactly why so many of us are unable to make this shift that you're talking about. Because I think a lot of people live their lives in such a way that their values and actions are not aligned. And even beyond that, I'm not entirely sure that everyone would even know what their values are to align them with their actions to a degree.
Yeah. Well, sometimes the thing that points you in the direction of what's meaningful to you is what are the things that tick you off that you just look at it and you say, this is wrong. And when I looked at families being separated and through no fault of their own and having to flee their own home, that was so wrong that I had to do something to help alleviate the situation, even in a tiny, tiny way. But the injustice of it, like, it was just so wrong. Like, a father should not have to say goodbye to his wife and child and risk his life to defend his country for no reason. Like, it was so wrong.
Yeah, that righteous indignation, I think you described it earlier.
Exactly. Righteous indignation.
Yeah.
That's that's a motivator. That's a deep well of inspiration and energy right there when you feel that righteous indignation. And when you stop feeling it in life, then maybe you've numbed yourself to the reality, because there is so much around us that's not fair and not right, and that hopefully we can do a little bit about to improve.
Wow. Great way to finish it off, Dan. Thank you again for taking the time. I'm personally inspired by this story, and I think a lot of the people listening to this will be inspired as well. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ryan. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for caring, and thank you for your thoughtful questions.